Welcome. Let us look at the classification of ribs. This lecture will unfold how ribs can be classified. Classification of ribs can be done according to what they look like, that is structural classification, and also how they are connected, which is based on their point of attachment. So to classify ribs based on what they look like, that is in terms of morphology or their structure, ribs can either be typical or atypical ribs. Typical ribs are ribs that have the same structural configuration, while atypical ribs are ribs that are distinct in their own way. Then classifying based on their point of attachment, we could have the true ribs, the false ribs, or the floating ribs. The true ribs are the ribs that are connected directly to the sternum. The false ribs have indirect connection with the sternum, while floating ribs, as the name implies, are floating and not connected to the sternum in any way. Let's dive into this classification to see what they present. For the structural classification, we already said that they could either be typical or atypical. For them to be typical, it means they are structurally identical, which means that they look alike in terms of their morphology. And these ribs range from the 3rd rib to the 9th rib. And this is what a typical ribs look like. They have the head, they have the neck, which is the constriction that is seen after the head, and they have the tubercle. After the tubercle, we then have the longest part, which is the body or the shaft. So this is the general configuration of what a typical rib looks like. For the atypical ribs that are distinct, they have special features that make them distinct from the typical ribs. And this ranges from the 1st rib, the 2nd rib, the 10th rib, the 11th, and also the 12th rib. So this is an example of atypical ribs, which is the 1st rib. And what is distinct with the 1st rib is that it is wider and broader than what is seen in the typical ribs. Also to add that around the head of the 1st rib, instead of the 2 facets that is seen in the typical ribs, which are the superior and the inferior facets, for the 1st rib, we have just 1 facet. So you can see that they have distinct features that are seen in the atypical ribs. And that is why they are classified as atypical, because they are not like the typical ribs. Going further on classification based on attachment, it is good for us to establish that in the thoracic cage, we have the thoracic vertebra posteriorly and we have the sternum anteriorly. Then we have the ribs spanning between the thoracic vertebra posteriorly and to the sternum anteriorly. So that is the basic pattern that is seen in the thoracic cage. But even though all the ribs are structurally connected to the thoracic vertebra posteriorly, in the anterior region is where we have this variation. All the ribs originate from the thoracic vertebra posteriorly, but when they span through, on getting to the anterior region, they have different patterns by which they are connected to the sternum, either that they are directly connected to the sternum or indirectly connected to it, or even not connected to it at all. And it is on this basis that ribs are classified based on their point of attachment, because posteriorly they are all connected to the thoracic vertebra, but anteriorly is where you have this variation. So let's dive into this to see how this is established in trying to classify the ribs according to their connection or their point of attachment. So the first one is the true ribs. From the name true ribs, that means they are the actual ribs. So they are connected to the thoracic vertebra posteriorly. Anteriorly, they have a direct connection with the sternum, and this ranges from the 1st to the 7th rib. And this is where you have the true ribs, the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and the 7th rib. If you look at these ribs, you see that they have direct connection with the sternum anteriorly. So they are directly connected to the sternum, although through the costal cartilages. Then secondly, we have the 1st rib, which are the pseudo ribs. You have rib 8, rib 9, and rib 10. In this category. And if you look at the pattern by which the ribs are connected, you see that they are not directly connected to the sternum. What they are connected with is the costal cartilage that is seen above them. So they tend to like connect with the costal cartilages superior to them, and that is how they go before they are finally linked to the sternum. So this is like an indirect connection with the sternum. So we said that the 1st ribs are indirectly connected to the sternum, and that is what is presented here. Then the last class is the floating ribs. This, from the name, we should already know what it means. Floating means they do not have any structural link with the sternum at all, either directly or indirectly. So we have the 11th and the 12th rib in this category, and this is the 11th rib. This is the 12th rib. So these ribs are floating ribs. They do not have the grace to extend to the anterior part of the thoracic cage. So you see them floating around this region. So this is the basis onto which ribs are classified. You can either classify them based on what they look like, whether they are typical or atypical, depending on whether they have a general configuration that is seen in other ribs, or they have distinct features that make them different from the typical ribs, or you can classify them based on their point of attachment. And this could either be whether they are directly connected to the sternum, indirectly connected with it, or are not connected with it at all. You can check your understanding of this lecture by classifying the following ribs: the first rib, the 12th rib, and also the 4th rib. Your classification should be based on structure, that is what they look like, and also their point of attachment. So thanks for watching this video.